I want to tell you about this book, The Creature from Jekyll Island by Edward Griffin. This is both a great book and a dangerous book, I could say. So, on one hand, there is a great history of central banks, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which has great information. But as you read the book, you have to be able to filter out conspiracy theories. The author, if you look him up on Wikipedia, if I just looked up the author, I never would have looked up the author first. I never would have read the book. Like, crazy conspiracy theory believer guy. And conspiracy theories are sort of filtered throughout the book. And now, for me, I'm somebody who, I don't believe in conspiracy theories just in general. I don't believe conspiracy theories can exist by definition. I don't believe in them, and I'm able to spot sort of that silliness. I mean, when I look at a news feed, just from the title of news articles, I can spot fake news. I have this ability. So for me, reading this book was fine. I was able to pick, get the real history that I thought was valuable and skim over or laugh at the conspiracy theories. If you don't have that ability, you can watch my video. Maybe I'll give you a guide of how to read this book. But also, you may have to be careful because you may come out of reading this book and be as crazy as the author. So first, let me explain what's great about the book and what I got from it, and then I'll get into what conspiracy theory stuff he has in there and maybe how to avoid it. Okay, so first, the real value of this book for me was the history of central banks. So basically, to try to make a long story short, and some of this, I'm going to start from the beginning here, where he didn't start from the beginning, which was, gold becomes, one of the main reserve currencies. And originally, banks, what you would do is you would deposit your money, whatever it was, gold or silver or whatever, and you would deposit to a bank who would hold it for you. And then, the bank could be used to pay other people for you, could issue paper against your holdings. And the idea was, though, if you gave a bank, an ounce of gold, they would hold your ounce of gold, for you. But because most people, when they deposit things, and then after they establish trust, they don't take it out. And so banks sort of learn naturally, and throughout history, every time a bank starts to become trusted for holding deposits, they start lending out and not holding all of their deposits, because they can get away with it for a long time. And so eventually banking sort of converted into what we now call fractional reserve banking. Most of us know that when you give a bank $100, it's not even a deposit, it's a loan. You lose right to your money. You're giving the bank your money. They owe it to you, but you're loaning it to them. They can do whatever they want, and they then loan out. If you give a bank $100, 90 of it, they are free to loan to other people. So they don't hold your money, and they don't even have to. But when banks first started doing that, that was shady and basically against the law. But it happened so often that it started to become accepted, because the people who had all the money and the power were the ones doing the fractional reserve banking, because it's a great way to make money. But it caused a lot of problems, because if a bank doesn't hold all your money and you think it's there, and then there would be run on banks, it was very chaotic. And so the central banks came about as a way to manage fractional reserve banking. The ironic part about this book is a lot of what this is, talking about our existing fractional reserve banking system as if it's horrible and central banks are horrible and cause all the ills in the world. I came away from this book with a greater respect for central banks. What I got from this book, and I don't think it was the author's intention, was that central banking created an improvement from the previous banking system, which was fractional reserve banking without central banks, is worse than central banks, Fractional reserve banking without central banks is worse than our current system, which is fractional reserve banking with a central bank. A central bank provides several things. So, for example, if there's a run on one bank, the central bank could come in and fund and recover it and do something to sort of save the system. And so then there isn't a run on other banks. The central bank, the lender of last resort, sort of does make the fractional reserve banking system more stable. And then, so he talks about the history of central banks in general, which started in the 1800s. They started, experimenting with these things because there was chaos with the banking system. And so then countries tried several central banks. They usually didn't last that long either, the central banks. Most banks didn't last. When I say not that long, 40, 50 years is kind of long. But, if you look long history, that's not that long. But banks would build up trust over 10 to 15 years. Then they would start, taking out the deposits and using them for other things. And then eventually there'd be a run on the bank, and that would be the end of it. Central banks played a little improvement. But finally, our central bank, the Federal Reserve, was an extra improvement on the central banking system for a number of reasons. It still supplied the lender of last resort situation, but one other thing it did so now what happens with our existing system is money is created not actually by the Fed, but by banks when they create loans. So if you deposit $100 into a bank, the bank then has that, it says to you, okay, you have $100 and I'm holding it. So there's that $100 exists. Then they loan out another $90. That's creating new money. So the only way to create money is by making loans. And the reason this is better than just printing and giving out money is when you make a loan, you're charging some interest. You're sort of only printing money for those who think they're going to increase value, therefore to be able to afford the interest. So in a sense, our current central bank system restricts the printing mostly to businesses and those who think they can increase value to be able to afford interest. So it sort of is an improvement on the willy-nilly printing of money and buying boats. It's printing money mostly to give to businesses. And also the central bank oversees how much is printed. There, a lot of us now talk about with their inflation, 3% a year inflation is theft. And someday, with the new cryptocurrency world, I think we may look at 0.1% inflation as high, maybe acceptable. This 3% starts to look really high with the new systems that are being developed. But 100 years ago, 3% a year inflation? Wow, that's awesome. That's not a lot compared to what we used to have. And so they sort of they used inflation to sort of support the system, but 3% is livable. Like businesses and society can survive and get a greater return than the 3%. And so that was sustainable. And so that was sort of another improvement. Now, again, until this cryptocurrency revolution in Bitcoin, I don't think there's no better, for those of us, maybe you hate central banks, but it's like, well, what else? What is your other option? Now we do have another option, but before we really didn't, because the other thing is you could say, now Austrian Economics, if you've heard of that, talks about banking should be 100%. They should keep 100% of the reserves. And now that's a hot topic for another video. And I may believe that, this debt-based society and fractional reserve and, lots of debt creates volatility and is a worse system than having, banks hold 100% of your money. It should be less volatile, at least in theory. But that's been impossible to enforce for hundreds of years. Like, banks, they don't do that because, it's so easy for them to lend it out and nobody knows. So there's sort of the Austrian economics philosophy may be correct in theory, but before cryptocurrency was impossible to implement. And so the system we have, like they say about democracy is the worst system except for all the other options. And I think central banking is the same thing. It's the worst, but better than all the other options until cryptocurrency. That's a whole other story that we now have a better way. But let me continue on with what it talks about with the book here. So, all right, yeah, and so the value of this book was just the history. You know, did you even know that the current central bank in the U.S., the Federal Reserve, is the fourth central bank the U.S. had? The first three failed, and the Central Reserve, the central current Federal Reserve lasted. Now let's talk about the whole conspiracy theory thing. And first of all, by the way, one thing he brings up, which this I sort of agree with, we call it the Federal Reserve, which implies federal implies that it's government, and reserve implies that they have savings, right? A reserve, they're saving something to back up the system. Actually, it's not government. Federal Reserve is independent. It is a bank cartel, and they don't have any reserves. They chose that name because it sounds good. And that's something that, is that a conspiracy theory? I don't think so. I think it's just natural. To me, that's just marketing, Sometimes there's a thin line between bad behavior and good marketing, and maybe that is bad. But anyways, let me talk about some of the conspiracy theory thing. I think, first of all, in the book, there's a lot of moaning. I think you can hear the author moaning as he's writing, because there's things like, as the system is, these banks, they work on a fractional reserve. They don't have much to back things up. When something goes wrong, they run out of money and they have to be bailed out. That's how the system has worked for hundreds of years. And this book goes into detail of all the several times that this has happened and the catastrophes that have happened during a banking crisis. It's always a problem. No one likes a banking crisis. But he's like, it's always like, and then they printed all this money to bail them out, and oh my God, it's so horrible. He's just moaning about it. That's sort of one thing. And there's also, bankers are sort of involved in everything. Money requires everything. So there's a lot of, every war, throughout history, they needed money to fund the war. And bankers were involved in the funding. And so, to me, I view that as, that's just life. Like, if there's a war happening and a country needs money, they're going to find it. This book sort of looks at it as, the banker wanted the war, and went out and gave the money to the government. And if it wasn't for the banker, there would have been no war. It's just, to an extent, some of that is true. I mean, if a country has absolutely no money, yeah, there would be no war. And there's a lot to be said, I don't even think it's from this book, that in 1913, all banks went off the gold standard and started printing in order to fund World War I. So it makes sense to say that maybe World War I would not have been as bad had governments or banks not printed a bunch of money. But at the same time, a lot of these things are just, the whole premeditated, I'm going to ruin the world by printing money. This book gives that impression. There's these evil characters looking to destroy the world. A lot of it's just human nature and the way the world works. And like I said, a bad character who needs money will find a banker. And so that's one thing. And also just even setting up the Federal Reserve. And the funny thing, like I said, from this book, I came away from this book with a more respect for central banking. But the author sort of puts it as it's all evil. So when they set up the Federal Reserve, the book starts about their secret meeting to talk about this new central bank, and it was a secret, and they're gonna control the money and all this stuff. But I believe the meeting happened, and most of the stuff that he talks about in the meeting I think happened. But I think a lot of times the author's thing is that the things that happened were true, but he views it with people with evil intentions looking to ruin the world, whereas I view it as these bankers were sort of like, well, this is going to be a more stable system, and yes, they benefit from it, and they're the ones running it and putting it together. But again, I don't see such evil intentions with all of these people. I think that, and they were successful in creating the Federal Reserve, has been better than what we had before it. Still, it was a disaster. It's sort of, like I said, I don't know, what were the other options? So, the central bank started, and immediately we had 1929, depression and crash and all this stuff, which you can sort of blame on the central bank. They certainly didn't make it worse. I don't know that it would make it better. They didn't make it better. Maybe it wasn't all their fault. So you can criticize the central bank system all you want, but compared to what we had before it, I don't know. So, another thing is like regulations. Often government regulations don't work, and they often even have the opposite effect. Look at they tried to increase housing. This wasn't in the book, but this is an example I can explain easily, which is, the government wants to increase home ownership in the U.S. So they create all this financial crap to make it easy for people to buy homes. And what happens is we have a housing crisis and less people buy homes. The author of this book, I think, would find examples of people who intentionally want to create this financial system that will steal homes from people. I think it's people actually believed that these regulations would help. Maybe they don't fully understand finance or the unintended consequences of some of their regulations, and it all went sour despite good intentions. I think there's a lot in this book about, I think there's bad intentions from the beginning, and I don't think that's the case. And again, with the bankers supporting, he's got a lot, the U.S. bankers, I can't even remember who. There were some U.S. bankers were involved in helping the communists when they got started. So, according to him, bankers love communism. It's just like they were looking for an opportunity. Here was one of the political parties. There were bankers, I'm sure, funding every organization in Russia vying for control. One of them wins, and that banker sort of wins, but I think the bankers, they're just doing their business, and they're not like, well, I love communism, so I'm only going to support them, and, we want to ruin the world. So, I hope you're getting the point. And then the last chapter of the book, he goes off the deep end. I mean, the author, he doesn't believe AIDS is real. He doesn't believe, there's crazy cancer. Cancer could be cured if it wasn't for the central bank. I don't know that he says that per se. I couldn't even read the last chapter. It was crazy. And I did skip some chapters because he goes off the deep end here and there. So you got to be careful. But I found it really, really interesting and enjoyable. And also, I got to say, thank God for this book, because I got on a plane to Thailand. I had a 12-hour flight. I thought I would have Wi-Fi on this beautiful plane in business class. They had no Wi-Fi. I almost had a panic attack. No Wi-Fi for 12 hours. But I was like, oh, I've got this book, Creature from Jekyll Island. It's a long book. I read the thing for 8 hours. Finished it. It's fabulous. So, thank you, Mr. Griffin, for saving my life on that flight. I mean, if I didn't have a book, I like I said, wouldn't have been pretty. So that's about it. Once again, Creature from Jekyll Island, Edward Griffin. I would read it, but read it with a skeptical eye. And you should learn, just briefly, about conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory means that there's something that has happened that is a secret that nobody knows about, but it's the truth, and it's sort of like a big deal. And to me, that is impossible to happen, because the bigger the secret, the more valuable it is to reveal the secret. And like literally, if whatever secret there is, if one person with real evidence goes on some news station, they can make tons of money by promoting this story and making a book. So the more people involved, anytime you hear a conspiracy theory, think about how many people have to hold that secret, how long they have to hold that secret, and how much money any one of those people could make by revealing the truth. And you see that these conspiracy theories are impossible to maintain. So I never believe in any of them. All right? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you.